The wind howled across the white stillness like a ghost. Snow blanketed everything, trees, tracks, bodies. The forest was silent except for the crunch of American boots pressing through frost that reached their knees. The men of the 99th Infantry Division were exhausted, laughing in short bursts just to fight off the cold. Hell froze over, one muttered. Another pointed to a line of snow-covered mounds ahead. Perfectly shaped, too perfect. Someone joked they looked like buried supply crates. They laughed again because laughter was easier than fear. Then Private First Class Martin kicked the nearest mound. The sound wasn't hollow, it was soft. He brushed away the snow with his glove. Beneath it was a helmet, and not American. The next mound revealed a frozen face, eyes open, glassy, staring straight through the storm. The laughter stopped. The soldiers froze, realizing what they were standing in. A field of German corpses camouflaged by nature itself. The first sign that the forest wasn't empty at all. Above them, in the distant ridgelines, unseen artillery waited, barrels cold, hidden perfectly in the snow, and this was only the beginning. The winter of 1944 was supposed to mark the end of the war in Europe. After the Allied landings in Normandy 6 months earlier, German resistance in France had collapsed faster than even the most optimistic generals had expected. Town after town fell, and by September Paris had been liberated. American, British, and Canadian forces surged toward Germany's western border, believing the Reich was already beaten. Commanders planned for Christmas at home. Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters envisioned only minor resistance before the final push into the Ruhr. But the war wasn't over. It was pausing, only for the storm. By December, the Allied advance had stretched supply lines thin. Fuel shortages crippled tanks, ammunition was rationed, and winter clothing was scarce. In some divisions, soldiers wore the same thin summer uniforms they'd landed with in June. Trucks froze to the roads. Radios cracked with static. The Ardennes region, a dense forest spanning Belgium and Luxembourg, became the quiet sector, a resting ground. Intelligence called it a ghost front. The terrain was so wooded, so treacherous, no sane general expected a major offensive there. Units rotated in and out for recovery. Men built fires, exchanged cigarettes, and waited out the cold. In reality, just across the tree line, Hitler was preparing his last gamble. From deep within the Reich Chancellery, plans were drawn for an audacious counteroffensive, a surprise attack to split the Allied line, recapture Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate peace. He called it Wacht am Rhein, watch on the Rhine. The logic was twisted but clear. If Germany could strike through the weakly held Ardennes, drive a wedge between American and British armies, and capture the Belgian ports, the Western Front might crumble. The war, already lost on the Eastern Front, could be prolonged, perhaps even reversed. By mid-December, 3 powerful German armies, the 6th SS Panzer, 5th Panzer, and 7th Army, quietly assembled behind the mist and pine of the Ardennes. Nearly 250,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and 1,900 artillery pieces waited in silence. Every movement was masked by the storm. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flew low under radar. Radio silence was absolute. Even the local civilians noticed little, only the growing tension in the air. Meanwhile, American commanders assumed the Germans were finished. Divisions like the 99th Infantry, 106th Infantry, and 28th Division were spread thin across 80 miles of forest, far too wide for defense. Many were new recruits. Few had seen real combat. As Christmas neared, snowfall thickened to blizzards. The Ardennes became a white ocean, soundless, deadly. Then at 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, the silence broke. Over 2,500 German artillery guns roared to life simultaneously. The ground shook. Trees splintered. Whole companies vanished in seconds. Communications were severed. Confusion reigned. From the smoke, tanks bearing the Balkenkreuz rolled forward, Panthers, Tigers, and armored half-tracks pushing through narrow forest roads. German infantry in snow camouflage advanced with machine guns and Panzerfausts, moving like ghosts through the trees. American soldiers stumbled from their foxholes, blinded by snow and disbelief. "They're attacking, here?" Someone shouted into a frozen radio. Yes, and with terrifying precision. By midday, entire American positions had been overrun. Towns like Losheimer Graben and Lanzerath fell, The 106th Division, trapped in the Schnee Eifel, was surrounded and destroyed. The Battle of the Bulge, the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army, had begun. And as snow covered the wreckage, the soldiers who survived soon learned that not everything hidden beneath that white silence was what it seemed. Because behind the main offensive, a second darker operation was unfolding, one designed not with bullets, but with deception. While the artillery thundered and tanks clawed through the Ardennes, another shadow campaign unfolded beneath the chaos, one that would haunt American soldiers long after the snow melted. The operation was called Greif, Griffin, conceived by Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's most daring commando officer. It was unlike anything the Western Front had seen before. Skorzeny, already infamous for rescuing Mussolini from a mountaintop in 1943, was now tasked with something far more audacious: to infiltrate the Allied lines disguised as Americans. His orders came directly from Hitler himself. German commandos, fluent in English, were to wear captured U.S. uniforms, drive seized Allied vehicles, and sow confusion behind enemy lines. They would switch road signs, spread false orders, redirect convoys, and sabotage communications. The operation's ultimate goal: to paralyze the American response long enough for the German armored spearheads to reach Antwerp. To make the deception work, German workshops repainted Panther tanks to resemble American M10 tank destroyers, altering silhouettes with false armor plating. Jeeps were captured in raids and reissued to German soldiers with faked identification papers. Even cigarette brands and chocolate bars were replicated, but the biggest weapon wasn't firepower. It was confusion. Inside captured villages, American MPs began hearing strange accents at checkpoints. Directions were given incorrectly. Convoys were misrouted. Bridges marked as secure suddenly exploded. By December 17th, the U.S. command suspected infiltration but couldn't identify who to trust. Soldiers began testing each other with questions only true Americans would know. Who won the World Series? What's the capital of Illinois? Wrong answers could mean execution. In this atmosphere of paranoia, the laughter vanished from the front lines. Meanwhile, Skorzeny's forces, operating in small groups, prowled through the fog. Some successfully diverted entire columns. Others were captured, tried, and executed as spies. Yet even in failure, the psychological damage was immense. Across the line, ordinary American soldiers found themselves second-guessing their comrades. Anyone who hesitated at a password or pronounced a word strangely was suspect. At the same time, the main German spearheads were driving forward under the same cloak of deceit. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, led by Joachim Peiper, was advancing toward the key crossroads town of Stavelot, aiming for the Meuse River. Peiper's column was heavily armed, more than 100 tanks and armored vehicles, but their biggest advantage was the weather. Thick fog and snow grounded Allied aircraft. The skies that had once belonged to the Americans were now silent. The Luftwaffe, briefly revived, took to the air again. For 5 days, the snow swallowed everything: sound, light, and human warmth. Villages changed hands overnight. Civilians fled or hid in basements, praying the war would pass over them. American units, cut off and surrounded, fought desperate delaying actions, often without knowing where the enemy truly was. And then, in the chaos, came Malmedy. On December 17th, a column of 113 American prisoners from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion was captured near the town of Bonnier, outside Malmedy. They were assembled in a field by Peiper's men. No one is entirely sure what sparked it: confusion, orders, or panic. But minutes later, machine guns opened fire. The prisoners fell in waves. Those who tried to flee were hunted down in the snow. When word of the massacre reached the American lines, it ignited fury. Orders went out: no quarter for SS troops. The Battle of the Bulge had already been brutal. Now it became personal. But amid that fury, strange things kept happening. A checkpoint officer swore he saw American MPs driving jeeps with perfect English, until he noticed the wrong wrench hanging from a belt. In one captured jeep, a folded map bore German handwriting, and somewhere in the forest, soldiers kept finding frozen shapes beneath the snow, bodies that weren't theirs, faces that didn't belong. The laughter from the early days of December had long died. The Ardennes was no longer quiet. It had become a mirror of madness, white, cold, and full of ghosts. And behind that frozen mirror lay the deeper human story of courage, deception, and survival in a war where truth itself could be hidden under snow. The human angle. Fear beneath the snow, for the soldiers in the Ardennes. The battle wasn't just fought with rifles, it was fought with the mind. Each night the temperature dropped below freezing. Men awoke to find their boots solid with ice. Frost formed on rifle barrels. Rations froze solid and canteens turned to blocks of ice. The cold was as lethal as the bullets. In the foxholes, conversations grew short. Laughter faded to whispers. Every sound in the trees, a snapping branch, a muffled thud, could mean an approaching enemy or simply snow falling from a branch. Many soldiers hadn't slept in days. They fought fatigue, frostbite, and the haunting sense that the forest itself was watching them. Letters home spoke not of glory, but of endurance. One GI wrote, "You can't tell friend from foe anymore. The snow hides everything. Even the living look dead." The Ardennes became a test not only of strategy but of human spirit. Some broke, some endured, but all were changed by the silence. A silence that could erupt at any second into machine gun fire. And somewhere in that vast white stillness, an invisible enemy, fluent in their language, dressed like them, moved freely. The tactical angle, deception as a weapon the Germans had learned from defeat. Their mechanized divisions, once unstoppable in the early years of the war, were now crippled by lack of fuel and air cover. So they turned to the one tool still available, deception. Operation Greif wasn't merely disguise. It was strategy layered within chaos. Skorzeni's units had infiltrated not to win battles directly, but to fracture trust. In warfare, doubt can kill faster than bullets. American commanders suddenly faced a nightmare scenario. They could no longer rely on their own system of recognition. Checkpoints multiplied. Soldiers spent more time verifying identity than fighting. Entire convoys were delayed because one driver couldn't name the capital of South Dakota. It was brilliant psychological warfare. Even small acts of sabotage, one like switching road signs or redirecting columns caused massive confusion. Tanks meant to reinforce Bastogne ended up miles off course. Skorzeni's men, though few in number, amplified the impact of the German offensive by making every American soldier question reality. To counter it, General Eisenhower imposed strict verification protocols. MPs were ordered to detain anyone suspicious, even officers. The paranoia reached so high that Eisenhower himself was briefly placed under guard after false rumors spread that German commandos were hunting him disguised as British generals. The front lines had dissolved not only on maps but in minds. The technological angle. Steel in the snow of deception was the German mind's weapon. Then Panzer steel was its muscle. The offensive brought forth some of the most formidable armor of the war. Tiger IIs, Panther tanks and Jagdpanzer IVs, all pushing through. Narrow forest roads never meant for such weight. But what stunned the Americans wasn't just their presence. It was their disguise. Skorzeni's engineers had modified Panther tanks to mimic the profile of the US M10 tank destroyer. Plates were welded onto the turrets, silhouettes altered, stars painted on the hulls. From a distance in snow and fog, they were indistinguishable from American armor. The result was chaos. In the opening days of the offensive, several U.S. units opened fire on what they thought were friendly tanks, only to realize, too late, that the guns were turned toward them. Yet the disguise worked only briefly. The Panthers' weight and gun barrels eventually gave them away. Once the ruse was discovered, American anti-tank crews adapted quickly, using bazookas, 57mm guns, and airstrikes when weather allowed. Still, the fear lingered. Every tank silhouette in the snow became a question mark. Every jeep could be a trap. Technology in the Ardennes didn't just shape the battle. It blurred the line between trust and terror. And while steel clashed in the valleys, high command on both sides watched their gambles unfold, one chasing victory, the other fighting for survival. The battle was no longer just about territory. It was about belief. Who could convince the other that their strength was real? The leadership angle, command in the storm far from the front. Maps covered in red and blue pins told a different story, one of disbelief and urgency. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced the unthinkable, a German offensive stretching over 80 miles through terrain believed impassable. Reports arrived fragmented, radios choked with static. Units that were supposed to be resting had vanished under the weight of panzer divisions. Eisenhower's challenge wasn't only military, it was psychological. His field commanders were stunned, some even panicking. The enemy had launched its most ambitious counterattack since Normandy, and it had struck where the Allies were weakest. But Eisenhower refused hysteria. He reorganized, restructured, and ordered calm. "The enemy has made his move," he said. "Now we will make ours." In the frozen fields of Luxembourg, General Omar Bradley coordinated the desperate defense, while General George S. Patton, aggressive, unpredictable, and relentless when it was already planning the counterblow. At Verdun, during a command meeting on December 19th, Patton stunned his peers by announcing he could pivot his entire Third Army north within 48 hours. Others doubted it was possible. The roads were ice. The weather was crippling. But Patton's confidence was infectious. "Let's drive straight into their guts," he said, "and go to Bastogne." On the German side, leadership had turned inward. Hitler, isolated and delusional, commanded from his bunker with maps and fantasy divisions that no longer existed. His field marshals, Model, Dietrich, Manteuffel, executed the plan with skill but skepticism. They knew the odds were hopeless. Fuel reserves were almost gone. The offensive relied on capturing American fuel dumps to survive. Still, orders were orders. And so, under Hitler's will, hundreds of thousands marched into a blizzard toward an impossible victory. It was not strategy anymore. It was obsession. The moral angle. The war behind the snow war tests not only courage but conscience. The Ardennes did both. In the confusion of the offensive, boundaries between soldiers and civilians blurred. Belgian villagers were caught between retreating Americans and advancing Germans. Some offered shelter, others were executed as spies. The frozen woods became a graveyard for innocents. The Malmedy massacre, when news reached the front, changed everything. American troops, horrified and enraged, swore vengeance. Officially, orders forbade retaliation. Unofficially, some units took none. Captured SS soldiers were sometimes executed in the snow, a brutal mirror of what had been done to their own. Moral clarity, once sharp, dissolved into gray. Even American officers, committed to discipline, admitted that the snow had changed the rules. German commandos captured in U.S. uniforms faced immediate execution under the Geneva Convention's laws on espionage. Some begged in perfect English. Others maintained silence. One reportedly said before being shot, "We only did what your spies do in Berlin." The war in the Ardennes revealed that morality in warfare was fragile, a structure as brittle as ice under boots. In this winter of 1944, good men did what they had to, and sometimes what they shouldn't, to survive. The enemy's perspective. Desperation of a dying Reich for the German soldier. The Ardennes offensive was not hope, it was duty. Many of them knew the truth. The Reich was collapsing. The Eastern Front had become a slaughterhouse under the Red Army's advance. Cities like Aachen and Cologne lay in ruins, yet propaganda still promised miracles. Secret weapons, new tanks, the Führer's will. The offensive was sold as one last triumph, Die Letzte Offensive. Soldiers were told they would break through, reach Antwerp, and divide the Allies. In reality, most barely had enough fuel to reach the first objective. Infantrymen trudged through the forest with frozen bread and rusting rifles. Tanks stalled from lack of gasoline. Commanders siphoned fuel from wrecked vehicles just to keep moving. Morale wavered between fanatical loyalty and quiet despair. Yet despite exhaustion, their discipline remained terrifying. Skorzeny's men risked execution if caught. SS tankers fought to the last shell. Even as Allied artillery rained down, they kept advancing. Through villages like La Glaise, Stavelot, and La Roche, burning, retreating, and burning again. Many Germans realized this was not a path to victory, but to death. Yet they fought on, for comrades beside them, not for the Führer behind them. By Christmas Eve, the snow was red. Towns lay in ashes, but the offensive had slowed. The German tide that had surged with shocking force was now grinding to a halt. Starved of fuel and men, The question was no longer whether the Allies could hold him, it was when they would strike back. And that counterblow, when it came, would turn the Ardennes from a frozen nightmare into a furnace of fire and vengeance. The turning of the tide began not with a roar, but with a whisper. By December 21st, 1944, American soldiers across the Ardennes began to realize the scale of what they were truly facing. The laughter that had once drifted through snow-laden camps was gone. Every tree line now carried menace. Every corpse could be a trap. At forward checkpoints, MPs stopped columns of jeeps ordering soldiers to answer questions about baseball teams or state capitals. Suspicion was everywhere. A single misplaced word could end with a drawn pistol. The enemy wasn't just across the line. He was inside it. In the midst of this psychological storm came the horror of Malmedy. Word of the massacre spread like fire through frozen ranks. American patrols stumbled upon the field near Bonnier, bodies stiff and twisted in the snow. Some lay face down, others half buried by drifts. Their hands were bound. Many had been shot at point-blank range. When survivors were found, trembling, frostbitten, some crawling through the snow for miles, their testimonies were barely coherent. But one word repeated again and again: SS. The massacre changed everything. It shattered restraint. For the first time in the Western Front, American soldiers began to treat every SS trooper not as a combatant, but as an executioner in waiting. The battle once fought Bastogne, the frozen fortress, while the massacre darkened the American spirit. One small town became the crucible of defiance: Bastogne. A key crossroads town in Belgium, Bastogne was vital to both sides. For the Germans, capturing it meant cutting off Allied reinforcements. For the Americans, holding it meant preventing the entire front from collapsing. By December 19th, Bastogne was surrounded by German armor. The 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division, dug in under the command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. Supplies were scarce. Ammunition was low. The weather made air drops nearly impossible. For days, the town endured relentless shelling. Houses splintered into kindling. Civilians huddled in basements alongside paratroopers. Medics worked by candlelight, freezing fingers trembling as they stitched wounds. Then came the infamous demand for surrender. A German envoy arrived under a white flag, carrying a letter demanding Bastogne's immediate capitulation to avoid further bloodshed. McAuliffe read it, smiled faintly, and scribbled a single word: nuts. That reply, simple, defiant, and distinctly American, traveled faster than artillery. Within hours it became legend. Across the Ardennes, soldiers who thought the line would break now believed it might hold, but holding meant surviving. The Germans intensified their bombardment. Tanks pushed through the snow-choked roads, their engines howling like beasts in the night. Air cover was still impossible. The weather refused to clear. Supplies dwindled. Some men fought with scavenged weapons. Others stripped ammunition from the dead. On Christmas Eve, the night sky over Bastogne burned orange. The town was ringed by fire. To the south, Patton's Third Army was advancing but slowly, painfully through ice and artillery. Inside the town, the soldiers of the 101st refused to yield. They fought from doorways, from trenches, from behind shattered walls. Each street became a fortress, each hour a lifetime. And yet, despite hunger, cold, and encirclement, the defenders held their ground, for ground became a fight for retribution. The unmasking elsewhere across the front. The Germans' deception began to unravel. Captured American soldiers were interrogated, and cracks appeared in their disguise. Their slang was off. Their maps were in metric. Their cigarettes were rolled wrong. One used the term gasoline instead of gas. The spell of invisibility broke. Skorzeny's men were hunted down, their infiltration blunted by sheer vigilance. What had begun as a masterstroke of deception was now a desperate gamble, collapsing under its own weight. Still, its effects lingered. American trust, in uniforms, in orders, even in their own chain of command, had been shaken to the core. By December 24th, as Christmas dawned across the frozen fields, soldiers lit candles in their foxholes not for celebration, but remembrance for the men buried beneath the snow, and for the hope that Patton's tanks would reach them before the cold did. And somewhere beyond the ridges, a low rumble echoed through the fog. The sound of engines, thousands of them. Crawling north, the hunters were coming. The weather breaks on. The morning of December 26, 1944. The skies above Bastogne cleared. For the first time in over a week, sunlight broke through the clouds, weak, pale but unmistakable. And with it came the roar of C-47 transport planes, their engines echoing through the frozen valleys. Paratroopers lifted their helmets toward the light as supplies rained down. Ammunition, food, medical kits, and hope. The long-awaited air cover followed. P-47. Thunderbolts and typhoons streaked overhead, diving upon German columns trapped in the open. The fog that had shielded Hitler's offensive now betrayed it. Convoys that had crept unseen through the forest were blasted apart on snowbound roads. The balance had shifted. To the south, General George S. Patton's Third Army was closing in. Against every logistical nightmare, frozen engines, icy roads, fuel shortages, Patton's men advanced relentlessly, clearing each village at bayonet point. They fought through Ardennes, Neufchâteau, and Martelange, pushing toward Bastogne with a fury that seemed to defy nature itself. For every mile gained, dozens of men fell. But the momentum was unstoppable. The breakthrough at 4:50 p.m. on December 26th, lead elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division reached the southern perimeter of Bastogne. When their tanks broke through the snow-clogged road near Ardennes, the defenders inside the town could hear the distant rumble. Moments later, the first Sherman tank rolled into the town square, its crew covered in soot, frost, and disbelief. Paratroopers cheered, some crying openly. For days they had fought alone. Now, at last, the siege was broken. The link-up didn't end the fighting. Far from it. The Germans counterattacked fiercely, attempting to sever the corridor. But Patton's reinforcements held fast. Bastogne had survived. News spread across the front like wildfire. The nuts. Defense became the rallying cry of the Western Front. Soldiers who had been fighting for survival now fought with vengeance, and with the weather cleared, the full might of Allied air power returned. Fire from the sky between December 27th and January 2nd. Allied aircraft unleashed one of the most devastating aerial assaults of the Western Front. Columns of German tanks, once concealed by fog, were now exposed against the white canvas of snow. Fighter bombers tore through the sky, strafing roads and convoys. Villages that had been staging points for the Wehrmacht were reduced to blackened craters. Fuel trucks exploded like fireballs. Ammunition dumps vanished in thunderclaps. The Ardennes, once a fortress of stealth, became a graveyard of steel. Even elite SS divisions couldn't withstand it. Joachim Peiper's Kampfgruppe, trapped near Le Glaise, ran out of fuel and ammunition. Peiper was forced to abandon his vehicles, nearly 135 tanks and half-tracks, and retreat through the woods on foot. His men left behind everything: guns, rations, and their dead. For the first time, German officers began to speak openly of defeat. The collapse by January 8, 1945. The German offensive had spent its fury. The bulge that had once driven deep into Allied lines was collapsing inward. Hitler's dream of splitting the Western Front lay shattered in the snow. The cost was staggering. The Germans had lost over 100,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured, and nearly 800 tanks. The Allies suffered roughly 80,000 casualties, the bloodiest toll of any battle fought by the U.S. Army. The forest was quiet again, but it was a silence born of exhaustion, not peace. American soldiers walked through what had once been enemy positions, rows of frozen corpses, vehicles half buried in snow, rifles still clutched in lifeless hands. Some found comrades they had thought lost, others found only wreckage. The deception that had begun with laughter and disbelief now lay exposed, like the bodies once hidden beneath the snow. A field of ghosts in the aftermath of the battle. Patrols combed through abandoned villages, clearing mines and collecting the dead. It was there that the true remnants of Operation Greif were discovered. Uniforms stitched with false insignia, fake identification papers, and jeeps painted with Allied stars. Captured documents confirmed what many had suspected. Skorzeni's commandos had been operating across the entire sector, some reaching within miles of Eisenhower's headquarters in Versailles. But even in defeat, their impact lingered. The paranoia, the mistrust, the sense that anyone could be the enemy, had left scars deeper than any wound. By the time the front stabilized, the Ardennes had become a frozen mausoleum. Thousands of soldiers from both sides lay entombed beneath the same snow, indistinguishable in death. The laughter that had once echoed through the early days of December never returned. Instead, only the whisper of wind remained, blowing softly over the fields where men had laughed, until they saw what was hidden beneath the snow. The Ardennes had gone silent, but in that silence lay devastation. When the snow began to melt, what emerged from beneath it was not victory. It was a reckoning. Entire villages had been erased. Forests once alive with gunfire now stood broken, trees splintered like bones. American medics moved through the ruins, tagging the frozen bodies that dotted the roadsides. Some German, some American, many indistinguishable in the frost. By January 1945, Allied forces began the grim task of recovery. Casualty lists poured in. Over 19,000 Americans killed, 47,000 wounded, and 23,000 captured or missing. The Germans lost nearly 100,000 men, their elite panzer divisions decimated beyond repair. The once proud 6th SS Panzer Army, which had spearheaded Hitler's offensive, was now little more than scattered survivors trudging eastward through their own defeat. Fuel shortages forced tank crews to abandon their machines. Iron beasts left to rust in the snow. When Allied engineers cleared the roads, they found convoys of Panthers and Tigers frozen mid-retreat, their engines seized by cold, their turrets pointing toward nothing. In some, crews still sat inside, dead at their posts encased in ice. The toll on the Americans, for the U.S. Army, the Battle of the Bulge became a crucible. It was the largest, bloodiest single engagement in American history. Entire regiments had been wiped out in the opening week. The 106th Infantry Division, young, inexperienced, and untested, lost 2 of its regiments almost entirely in the Schnee-Eifel pocket. Survivors would later say that the snow wasn't white anymore. It was gray, mixed with ash and blood. Yet through that suffering came endurance. Divisions like the 101st Airborne, the 4th Armored, and the 2nd Infantry emerged as legends. Bastogne became a symbol not of siege, but of defiance, as one paratrooper wrote home after the relief. They threw everything they had at us, tanks, bombs, snow, and hell itself. But they couldn't break us. Not here. In towns newly retaken, civilians emerged from cellars where they had hidden for weeks. They greeted the Americans not with cheers, but with quiet gratitude. Too much had been lost for celebration, the German realization. On the German side, the defeat was catastrophic. Hitler's last gamble on the Western Front had failed completely. The fuel he had hoarded for the offensive was gone. The tanks he had promised would drive to Antwerp now lay destroyed in the woods of Belgium. His generals, Model, Manteuffel, and Dietrich, reported the truth reluctantly. The Wehrmacht no longer had the strength to hold the West. The failure of the Ardennes offensive marked the end of German strategic initiative in the war. From this point onward, the Reich would only retreat. Even Otto Skorzeny Operation Greif, though ingenious, proved ultimately futile. Of his roughly 2,000 commandos, most were captured or killed. Those who survived were branded as spies and executed. Yet their mission succeeded in one sense. They had sown fear so deep that it lingered even after their deaths. In interrogation, captured German officers spoke with exhaustion, not defiance. One panzer commander, when asked what had gone wrong, simply said, "We fought the snow, the sky, and the truth. The truth won." The battlefield today as January ended. Allied troops began the slow advance toward the Rhine. Snow still clung to the wreckage. Villagers buried their dead. And for the first time in months, the skies remained clear. But for those who had fought there, the Ardennes was never just another battle. It was a nightmare frozen in memory, where laughter turned to silence and silence to ghosts. The snow had hidden much. The dead, the deception, the cost of pride. But when it melted, the truth of the battle was laid bare. And as the Allies prepared to march into Germany, they carried that truth with them, etched not in medals, but in scars. The defeat in the Ardennes was not merely tactical, it was psychological. It marked the moment the Third Reich's delusions of victory shattered for good. Inside his mountain headquarters in Berchtesgaden, Adolf Hitler received the news with rage and disbelief. Reports from the front described entire divisions annihilated, tanks abandoned for lack of fuel, and thousands of prisoners taken. The watch on the Rhine that was meant to save Germany had instead hastened its death. Hitler blamed everyone but himself, his generals, the weather, even the supposed cowardice of his men. But the truth was unshakable. Germany's last great army had bled out in the snow. The Reich would never recover. By February 1945, Allied intelligence confirmed that the Ardennes offensive had drained Germany's final reserves of armor, fuel, and manpower. The Luftwaffe, briefly reawakened during the operation, was now grounded again, out of planes, out of pilots, out of fuel. The once feared panzer divisions were skeletons, incapable of stopping the Allied push to the Rhine. The Eastern Front, meanwhile, was collapsing. Only 3 weeks after the Battle of the Bulge ended, the Soviet Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, tearing through Poland and advancing to within 40 miles of Berlin. Hitler's gamble in the West had not delayed the inevitable, it had accelerated it. The shift in Allied confidence for the Allies. The Battle of the Bulge had been a brutal shock, but also a defining test. It forced commanders to confront overconfidence, to learn humility after months of easy victories following Normandy. The German surprise attack revealed cracks in Allied communication and intelligence, reminding them that the war was not yet won, and that underestimating a desperate enemy could be deadly. In the weeks following the battle, Eisenhower's headquarters shifted from cautious optimism to determined unity. The British, Americans, and Canadians, often divided by command rivalries, emerged from the Ardennes with a renewed sense of shared purpose. When Eisenhower visited Bastogne in January, he looked out over the destroyed town square and said quietly, "The enemy threw his best at us, and failed." The words were not triumph, they were realization. The end was near, but it had been earned through unimaginable cost. Bastogne's legacy in Bastogne, the surviving paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division were finally relieved in mid-January. They emerged from cellars and trenches hollow-eyed, frostbitten, and unshaven. The townspeople called them les sauveurs, the saviors, yet few of them felt like heroes. They had seen too much. Children frozen in doorways, comrades lost to the cold, entire neighborhoods obliterated. Still, Bastogne became a symbol of American resilience, a wordless answer to every future challenge. The phrase "nuts" echoed through generations of soldiers as proof that even in hopelessness, defiance mattered. In later years, survivors returned to the Ardennes. They walked the same roads, now quiet and lined with monuments. Some wept, some smiled faintly. One veteran stood before a field near Malmedy and said, "The snow remembers." The war moves on. By March 1945. The Allies crossed the Rhine. The German army could no longer mount any serious resistance. Town by town, city by city, the Western Front collapsed inward. Berlin would fall in May. The Ardennes offensive, intended as Hitler's last great victory, had achieved the opposite. It broke the Wehrmacht's back. It exposed the hollow myth of German invincibility, and it ensured that when the final blow came, it would be swift and absolute. For the men who fought there, though, victory carried no joy. They had seen the cost of arrogance, the cruelty of winter, and the fragility of the human spirit under war's weight. When the snow finally melted and spring touched the Ardennes, the ground was soft again, but beneath it lay the remnants of the last great gamble of Nazi Germany. The laughter that had begun the story was gone forever. In its place stood only the quiet dignity of survival, and that survival, fragile, frozen, and hard-won, was the truest victory of all.